Support for Frontline is provided by U.S. News and World Report.
Trust. For over 70 years, a commitment to playing it straight, getting it right. U.S. News and World Report. Trust matters.
With additional funding from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Frontline is made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Ten years ago, in the small East African country of Rwanda, 800,000 people were slaughtered by their own government.
This was ordinary men, women, and children, and the only reason that they were killed was because they were Tutsi.
Virtually the entire world turned away and did almost nothing to stop the genocide.
In retrospect, it all looks very clear, but at the time, what was happening in Rwanda, the situation was unclear.
They cannot tell me that they didn't know. Everybody knew what was happening.
Tonight on Frontline, the full story of perhaps the darkest and most brutal tragedy of our time. It is a story told by the victims and by the killers, by those who turned away and by those who stayed and tried desperately to save as many people as they could.
By the time the genocide was over, I was so angry at America. America the beautiful, America the brave.
They are all still haunted by what happened.
I was the commander, and hundreds of thousands of people died. I can't find any solace in statements like I did my best.
Still haunted by the ghosts of Rwanda.
Rwanda will never, ever leave me. It's in the pores of my body. My soul is in those hills. My spirit is with the spirits of all those people who were slaughtered and killed that I know of. And lots of those eyes still haunt me. Angry eyes or innocent eyes. No laughing eyes. But the worst eyes that haunt me are the eyes of those people who are totally bewildered. They're looking at me with my blue beret, and they're saying, what in the hell happened? How come I'm dying here? Those eyes dominate, and they're absolutely right. How come I failed? How come my mission failed? How come, as the commander, I did not convince, I lost soldiers, and 800,000 people died?
For General Romeo Dallaire, commander of the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda, it was his first trip to Africa.
You know, the first breath of air of Africa. Oh, what a phenomenal experience. It felt like you were in another continent. It was different. felt a little nervousness, of course, of the first shaking hands with those leaders and starting up the mission.
For Dallaire, a Canadian general who had never seen action, this was the command of a lifetime, a UN peacekeeping mission in the heart of Africa. His job seemed simple. He would enforce a peace agreement between the Rwandan government in Kigali and a rebel army positioned behind a ceasefire line. The rebels were mostly Tutsis, an ethnic minority that had been persecuted for decades.
Some of us had been refugees since 1959. And over the years, in early 60s, in 70s, there had been killings of Tutsis in different parts of Rwanda. So we mainly focused on the very fact that there was need for change in the country and that these stateless people, ourselves, were everywhere in the neighboring countries and beyond, needed to come back home.
The rebel threat had heightened tensions between Tutsis and the ethnic majority, the Hutus. The Hutus had ruled since independence from Belgium in the early 60s. Under the UN-backed peace accord, the Hutus would be forced to share power with the Tutsi rebels. But the peace process was already faltering, even as General Dallaire set up his command center in a rundown Kigali hotel. With only 2,500 lightly armed troops, he was ill-prepared to enforce a fragile peace in a country he did not understand.
We had very, very little information, knowledge of the background to Rwanda, its history, its culture, what had taken place in the country since independence or even before independence, and especially even in the last couple of years. So we went in quite blind.
From the moment he arrived, someone was testing Dallaire's ability to keep the peace. There were mysterious riots and assassinations.
And also, we were already getting all these stories about a third force, of squadrons of killers, and we couldn't confirm anything. We were just getting all that, as rumors, innuendos, and we couldn't cross-check the damn stuff because I was not allowed to have an intelligence capability. So all that sort of came as a dark cloud. Ultimately, I felt we could do it. But that is a bravado, I think, also from my part. Nothing was going to stop me. Bit of innocence in there, eh? Yeah.
Then, from inside the third force, an informant emerged. The informant revealed that a secretive group of Hutu extremists was plotting to derail the peace agreement and exterminate their enemies.
And he was within the higher structures of the MRND party, which was the hardline party of the president. He said that he simply wasn't going to continue to work in that atmosphere, that they were undermining the whole process, and they were ultimately planning the evilest of deeds of attacking not only Tutsis, but all the moderate Hutu leaders also.
The informant was a trainer for the Interahamwe, a paramilitary youth movement. He said they were planning to kill some of Dallaire's troops, Belgian soldiers, the backbone of the peacekeeping force.
Jean-Pierre, the informant, said they felt that if the Belgians were killed, that Belgium and the UN would pack up and leave. So already the situation was changing, that somebody didn't want us there, and that they were going to target us to encourage us to go.
In an urgent cable to the UN leadership, Dallaire repeated the informant's warnings that there was a plan to exterminate all Tutsis in Kigali, that Belgian peacekeepers would also be killed, in the belief that Belgium would then withdraw all its troops. Dallaire told New York he was going to raid the militia's arms caches. He signed off in his native French. Where there's a will, there's a way. Let's go.
I sent that, and then I went to bed and probably slept one of the best nights I had, because I felt that finally we were going to take a certain level of control that would permit us to do so much more.
The cable arrived in New York at the UN's peacekeeping department, then run by Kofi Annan.
The fax came in, and General Dallaire had also been in touch on the phone with General Baril. And in fact, he has sent other messages where sometimes he's questioned that somebody came and gave me this information. I don't know how sincere it is, whether I'm being manipulated or not, because intelligence can also be used to manipulate you.
Annan was skeptical. In his response, he ordered Dallaire, first, not to take any action, and second, to share the informant's secrets with the Rwandan government, which he knew had strong ties to the Hutu extremists.
Why did we go that route? Often shining light on these things and telling those planning it at the governmental level that the international community knows what is being planned. We are monitoring, we are going to deal with you harshly, and we know what you're up to. Sometimes it's a very good deterrent.
Annan told Dallaire he was not to raid the arms caches, and he must avoid any action that might cause UN troops to use force.
The big hammer at the end of the message that came to me within hours of my sending my information message was stop, decease, and by the by, you're totally outside of your mandate. At that time, the whole philosophy was, we don't want another Mogadishu, and so keep it tight.
Mogadishu. 3 months earlier, when the Black Hawks were shot down in Somalia, and 18 American soldiers died on a UN mission, it changed everything about Washington's commitment to peacekeeping, especially in Africa.
The Clinton administration was brought to its knees by the problem in Somalia. A Secretary of Defense was fired, a presidency was dramatically weakened, they were enormously criticized for this adventure in Somalia, and now you had another situation unfolding in Rwanda, and certainly no one was clamoring for a re-intervention into the heart of Africa.
Despite the growing sense of danger, Kigali was teeming with thousands of Western expatriates. Diplomats, aid workers, and their families. The official line from the UN and all their embassies was that Rwanda was still safe.
It was strange because on the one hand, here's little groups of 8 UN soldiers fully decked out, with all of their gear and their machine guns and everything, patrolling the city of 8, and we used to joke, you can't spit without hitting a UN car. And so you got all this white vehicles, black UN all over them, and occasionally you would see some white tanks or something. There was an incredible sense of security in that. And yet we also knew things were going to blow.
Hutu extremists were now confident the UN would not stand in their way. They imported thousands of machetes, prepared death lists, and began targeting their political opponents.
être tout simplement infernal.
It became simply a nightmare for the Tutsis, for all of the members of the opposition parties, even if they were Hutu. And we lived through a series of political assassinations almost on a daily basis.
Presque au quotidien.
Every day God gave us, we had 3, 4, 5 dead bodies. People that we picked up on the streets every day.
And people tried to tell us and tried to explain to us or help us understand, but maybe we just didn't get it. It was just very hard to conceive of something so awful actually being meticulously planned and carried out.
In central Kigali, a group of friends gathered for dinner at the home of a young American diplomat, Laura Lane.
We had a couple friends over, and we just sat down to dinner, and all of a sudden there was a huge explosion, and I didn't instantly, come to me what that was, because I wasn't used to hearing those kinds of sounds.
And then at 8:30, the first phone call came in, saying that originally the first phone call said that there had been a big explosion in Kanombe camp, which is just at the end of the runway of the airfield, the Kigali airfield, saying that it looked like an ammunition dump had exploded.
And it went from there's been an explosion at the airport to we think it's the ammunition dump at Kanombe that's blown up to it's a plane that's crashed to it's the presidential plane that's crashed.
Someone had fired a missile that shot down the Hutu president's airplane. Even 10 years later, the responsibility for the attack remains a mystery.
There are many theories as to who shot down the plane. I don't know if anybody has the answer to that. Was it Hutu extremists or was it Tutsi extremists? Was it done by the Tutsis as an excuse to begin the movement south by the RPF and take control of the country? Hard to say. Or was it used by the Hutu extremists to begin the genocide that took place? I don't know the answer to that.
That night, UN commanders were summoned to a crisis meeting at Rwandan Army headquarters.
We were heading through very darkened streets in Kigali, very quiet streets. There was no one. The streets were just empty. It was like a ghost town.
They found a leading Hutu extremist, Colonel Theoneste Bagosora, in control.
Colonel Bagosora, who was the chef de cabinet of the Minister of National Defense and a hardline person, in fact, considered even more than hardline. He was chairing the meeting.
Bagosora had once vowed to launch an apocalypse against the Tutsis. Dallaire insisted he step aside and hand power to the moderate acting Prime Minister, Madame Agath. Dallaire knew she would resist the extremists' power grab and appeal for calm.
Bagosora kept saying that she is of no use. She never was able to garner her cabinet anyways.
And an officer that was sitting next to me stunk of booze. Started swearing in French underneath his breath about her and calling her various names. And so we were stalemated.
Dallaire asked UN headquarters for guidance. They responded by tightening his rules of engagement. He was ordered not to intervene, and above all, to avoid armed conflict.
We were concerned, one, that Dallaire and his force didn't have the capacity and didn't to take on that sort of responsibility, and that if they attempted to do it and any of the peacekeepers were killed, we may see a repeat of Somalia, and we may not even be able to offer any assistance.
You heard gunshots, you heard screams, you heard just so much activity that you knew this was going to be, an awful night. And in the darkness, you were just, I remember feeling like, I don't want the daylight to come because I don't want to see, knowing what I'm hearing.
Well, what's going on here, huh? We got all the kids in the hallway and the television. This is April 7. It's about 6 o'clock in the morning, and we were woken up at about 5:15, 5:20 by a lot of gunfire and stuff.
Yeah, the killing was happening right there. Our kids were listening in. While they're describing on the radio, and I'm talking back to them and saying how people are being killed in their front yard, and I'm saying we're trying to get help, and we're just trying to figure out what we can do. This whole drama's unfolding, and our kids are standing there glued to this thing, and all of a sudden I go, whoa, I see, one of them standing there and just transfixed, and I say, Teresa, take them away.
That morning, Dallaire sent Belgian and Ghanaian peacekeepers to guard Madame Agath, the moderate prime minister. Then he went to find the extremist leadership.
Agath was getting all the protection she needed, at least we expected it needed. I mean, they ended up by having 25 troops there. With that sort of in hand, my job now, because I was moving around, is to go get a hold of Baghassar and say, okay, what's going on now? What is the situation? Roadblocks were coming up. But as I got closer to the inner core of the city, the roadblocks became more serious, and ultimately the roadblocks in that inner circle there was controlled by the Presidential Guard. And so we made our way to the Ministry of Defense. Nobody was there. So I said, well, maybe they're right back to where they were last night. So just turned and went towards the SM.
As Dallaire looked for the extremist leaders, the Prime Minister's house was surrounded by Rwandan troops. Inside, UN peacekeepers sent to protect her were under orders not to use force. The Prime Minister called her neighbor, American diplomat Joyce Leader.
About 8:30 in the morning, she called and asked if she could come and hide in my house.
The Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister. And I didn't give it very much thought, and I said yes. But then when the Ghanaian peacekeeper who was guarding her, he must have put a ladder up on her side of the fence, and he came up he raised his head above the fence, and there were shots fired just then.
Rwandan troops stormed the Prime Minister's compound. The peacekeepers radioed for instructions from Dallaire's Ghanaian deputy.
We were in communication with them all along, and it was not even rational for them to try to oppose them. The best they could do was to talk to them, to negotiate, to tell them, look, what you're about to do is wrong, you cannot do it.
At gunpoint, the UN troops surrendered their weapons to the Rwandans. The Ghanaian peacekeepers were soon released, but the 10 Belgian troops were taken hostage and led away.
Their radios became silent. Then you suspected something had gone wrong because communication was suddenly cut off. Then you sense a danger. Something must have happened.
About another half hour later, we actually heard a scream and a shot and realized that it was the Prime Minister who had been found and killed.
General Dallaire hadn't heard of the attack, but he'd learned the extremist leadership was meeting at Army headquarters. As he approached, Dallaire caught a glimpse of his soldiers inside the Army compound, lying in the dirt.
And at the gate, as we went by, I saw two soldiers in a Belgian uniform lying on the ground about 50-odd meters inside the camp. And so your whole life is dependent on those nanoseconds of taking that right decisions, because it's life and death. I was already saying, I can't get those guys out of there. I just don't have the forces or the deployment capability. I've got so many other troops that I don't know of, and all the vulnerability of the rest. I can't take these bastards on. To do anything for them and for the others, I had to negotiate.
Dallaire carried on through the next gate to confront the extremist leadership. But he decided not to mention his troops, who he knew were being beaten 200 yards away.
What I said was, get a grip of your units. I'm staying. The informant, Jean-Pierre, had told us that they were trying to set up to wipe out a dozen or so, or 10 Belgians, in order to break the back of our mission, because if the Belgians pulled out, I had no real substantive capability to sustain myself, and that the international community would pull us all out. These guys knew about Mogadishu also. And so what I was making clear to them was that I'm staying.
Dallaire later demanded to know what had happened to the Belgians, but he took no military action to rescue his troops.
Finally, a phone call after insistence came in and said that they are all at the hospital, at the morgue. And so I said, right, let's go. The morgue was a little shack, and a bit of an L-shaped small shack. And there was a 25-watt bulb at best. And there in the corner of the L shape was this pile of potato bags. Just looked like a pile of big, huge potato bags. And as we got closer, we saw that they were bodies.
In the wake of Somalia, the murder of more Western peacekeepers triggered an immediate response.
Good afternoon, everybody. I wanted to start with the situation in Rwanda. The President called the Secretary of State this morning to express the President's concern about the safety of Americans in Rwanda in light of the deteriorating situation there.
By that morning, we kind of had a sense that we were not going to be able to wait this out. I took our wedding album, we took our guns, and put the dog at our feet and literally slumped down in the car and drove down the streets, like just looking over the dashboard, you know, as we hear fire in the background, and made it to the embassy.
The Clinton administration ordered an immediate evacuation of all 257 U.S. citizens in Rwanda. It was up to Laura Lane to get every American out alive.
We said we have to, evacuate the American community out because we couldn't risk, their lives trying to wait this out, because if this was a plan, it had a larger purpose, and that larger purpose would not be good where you'd want anyone in harm's way.
But Lane told Washington she wanted to stay and keep the embassy open as a safe haven for Rwandans.
I felt very, very strongly that if there is someone who is planning this kind of evil, They need to know that there is also another group, that we, the Americans, will stand right here and stand against them. And I felt very, very strongly about that, because otherwise they think they could get away with it.
Yeah, I do recall there was the notion that, yes, maybe we could stay behind and maybe we could do something. But then you have to say, with what do you create a safe haven? If the Belgian troops could not defend and protect the Prime Minister from a ruthless attack, what were unarmed Americans bearing a flag going to do?
Maybe hopelessly naive. I mean, we were 4 people in an embassy, and very small embassy community. But I don't know, I think one person can make a difference, and maybe if we just saved one life, that was one life worth saving. Maybe we couldn't save everyone, but I would have rather stood there and said, and stayed and said, I am going to stay because it is worth that risk. So, in the end, the decision was taken out of my hands.
All embassies in Kigali closed. Aid workers and diplomats were ordered out of the country.
We started going out, picking up our military observers who were at various locations, picking up our UN staff, picking up diplomats, picking up people at risk. And we started a whole series of what we call rescue missions to go pick people up, try to locate them.
Beardsley went to rescue Polish Catholic priests trapped with 2 UN observers in a Kigali church where Tutsis had sought refuge.
The military observers and the priests could hear people screaming over the church, so they'd left their quarters and had come over to see what was going on. They were grabbed and they were put up against the wall with a rifle underneath their chin, and they were held there while the identity cards were captured, were burned. And then the militia came in, and the gendarmes the police literally handed them over to the militia, who then proceeded through the rest of the evening to chop them apart with machetes. Inside the church itself were about 150 people. About 15 of them were still alive. The rest had been attacked with machetes and had been killed. And the thing that stood out in my mind up until that day, it almost bore the resemblance of a coup, taking out the moderates. But this was different. This was just ordinary men, women, and children, and the only reason whatsoever that they were killed and targeted was because they were Tutsi.
Behind the ceasefire line, the Tutsi rebels of the Rwandan Patriotic Front were preparing to respond.
The information very clearly came in very fast, showing how targeted killings were being carried out and how these were spreading out, not only in Kigali, but going beyond Kigali to other parts of the country. And we knew that was the usual style. The massacres had started. And we have to take action.
The rebels declared the peace process dead and attacked the extremist government. General Kagame had gone through training at Fort Leavenworth. The U.S. military maintained contact and understood the rebel leaders' intentions.
In retrospect, there was no chance, I think, that the RPF was in any mood to negotiate right from the beginning.
They wanted what?
They wanted to take control of the country. They wanted to take over control politically, militarily. There was no way you're going to stop the RPF. There was no way that they were in the mood to negotiate once this all started.
Overnight, 1,000 French and Belgian paratroopers had arrived without warning, seizing Kigali airport. These troops were not under UN command. Their mission was solely to get the expatriates out. Dozens of journalists had arrived with the new troops. They traveled with Belgian soldiers to Kigali's psychiatric hospital, where the Western staff was trapped. On the way in, they drove past the Interahamwe, waiting outside. Tutsis emerged from the hospital building, where they'd been hiding for 3 days. They said they were surrounded by the militias, that some of them had already been killed.
Depuis 3 jours, il y a déjà des cadavres là-dedans.
When it was clear the soldiers weren't going to help, the refugees appealed to the journalists.
It was a whole group of people, but in the whole group, one woman started to speak and started to explain why they were afraid and what was happening to them. And she started begging us to take her and the others with us. She was speaking to me, a woman to a woman, saying, "I'm afraid, please help me." Yeah, we were just listening to her, and then we couldn't do anything. At that moment, we thought we couldn't do anything, just listen and say yes. So we left. For the white people, it's over. Between you, the hundreds that stayed. And we heard the shooting at the moment we left. So it was clear for me that hell starts for them.
All Western troops and UN peacekeepers were under orders not to evacuate ordinary Rwandans.
What that meant was anybody that was white-skinned got to get on an airplane and fly to safety, and anybody that was black-skinned got to stay in Rwanda and get killed. And that's as simple as it came down to. It still to this day leaves a very, very bad taste in my mouth that the United States of America could have 350 Marines sitting at Bujumbura Airport, that the French were able to get in 500 or so paratroopers, that the Belgians had over 1,000 paratroopers. We basically had our intervention force already on the ground. What they later told us, it was impossible to get on the ground. We had it on the ground on the 10th of April, within 3 days of this thing starting. And but it wasn't there to intervene. It wasn't there to save Rwandans. It was there to save white people. And that's what it came down to.
With the airport taking fire, the American embassy decided to evacuate its staff and expatriates overland in convoys south to Burundi, where U.S. Marines were waiting.
And there were people standing on either side of the road. And it's my recollection that I saw some instruments like machetes in their hands. And I remember thinking, well, they're just waiting for us to get out of here before they go on about their gruesome business.
I was working for the American embassy, basically. I saw them leaving. I saw the flags and the vehicles. I know all the vehicles, I know all the peoples they belong to, and so on. So I said, okay. I think it was sad, surprising to see that by the end of the day, you are a person who has to die, when other people are allowed to be alive. This is a strange feeling. Americans were allowed to be alive. My neighbors were allowed to be alive. They were walking on the street, they were going to the market. And we were here feeling that we had to die anyway.
As she organized the last American convoy, Laura Lane made a final attempt to do what she thought was right.
We had a convoy of over 100 vehicles with over 600 people, only 9 Americans. Greg and I were the last 2. The ambassador was at the front. And yes, there were Rwandans in there. There were Tutsis in there, and in some cases there were Hutus. And so if they made it to our checkpoints and we could hide them, we did. Some of them were, we dubbed them Americans for the day. You know what I mean? We made them honorary Americans so that they could be in the convoy.
If people in Rwanda ever needed help, now was the time. And everybody's leaving.
Carl Wilkins had put his family on an American convoy, but he decided to stay behind with Rwandan colleagues and workers who'd sought refuge in his home.
That Tutsi young lady and that Tutsi young man were faces right there to me representing the country, and I felt if I left, they were going to be killed. And then I recognized, how is it? I got this blue American passport. That means I can go, but all of these people don't have a passport. They can't go. And while all of those things played in, the bottom line is it just seemed the right thing to do.
By the evening of April 10th, Carl Wilkins was the only American left in Rwanda.
As far as I know, everyone in Kigali who's wanted to leave has been able to leave, and they're probably successfully out by now, safely out by now. Thanks very much.
The Clinton administration breathed a sigh of relief. In Belgium, the country was in crisis. With 10 of its soldiers dead, the government wanted to pull all its peacekeepers out of Rwanda. But it didn't want to be embarrassed by leaving alone. The foreign minister called Secretary of State Warren Christopher.
The reaction of the public opinion in Belgium was very strong, and I may say there was unanimity in order to ask to pull out the troops after the killing. Warren Christopher told me that he understood perfectly why the Belgian government took that decision. He confirmed that the preference of the Americans went to the withdrawal of the Minuar.
Quite clearly, the Belgians wanted to have a cover of having others leave as well, I think, and we did. We yielded to that request. In retrospect, I wonder if that was the right thing to do.
Christopher instructed Madeleine Albright, America's ambassador at the UN, to push for the withdrawal of the entire peacekeeping force.
My instructions were to support full withdrawal. And I listened to the discussion very carefully in the Security Council, and I could see that our position was wrong, and especially in listening to the African delegate, Ambassador Gambari from Nigeria, was very moving on this.
And I had the full backing of my colleagues to argue on the contrary, that we must forget about cutting and running, that it will be callous, it will be contradictory to the spirit of the Charter, which says Security Council has a responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security everywhere in the world, including Africa.
And I asked my deputy to take my seat while I left and went out into the hall, into these phone booths, and called Washington. And they said, well, no, we're worrying about this, and these are your instructions. And I actually screamed into the phone. I said, they're unacceptable. I want them changed.
Albright's call was to Richard Clark, head of peacekeeping at the National Security Council. Clark declined to talk to Frontline, but he did talk to journalist Samantha Power.
and they end up in a screaming match. The fight is not about whether to send U.S. troops to Rwanda. That's not even contemplated. The fight is simply about how to withdraw the UN peacekeepers and how many to withdraw and how many to leave in place and what the function of those peacekeepers should be who remain in place. That's what the fight is about. That's the extent of the dissent at the highest level of the U.S. government about this genocide. That's it. That phone call.
With the United States demanding a withdrawal, the UN instructed General Dallaire to start closing down his peacekeeping mission. Dallaire turned to his deputy, General Henry Aniadoho, for advice.
And I remember sitting in front of his desk, huge man sitting there, stoic. And I said, Henry, they want us out. We've failed in the mission. We've failed in attempting to convince. We failed the Rwandans. We are going to run and cut the losses. That's what they want us to do.
And I said, no, we haven't failed. And as commanders, we are going to sit here, work hard, and see to its solution. So let's tell those people back in New York that we do not think that the mission should be closed.
Aniadoho assured Dallaire his Ghanaian peacekeepers would stay.
And that was all I needed. That meant that I would still have troops on the ground, which were good troops, not well equipped, but good troops. So I stood up and I said, Henry, we're not going to run. We're not going to abandon the mission. And we will not be held in history of being accountable for the abandonment of the Rwandan people. It was just morally corrupt to do that. And that's when I went back and told them to go to hell.
As the UN debated whether to keep a peacekeeping force in Kigali, the extremist Hutu leadership implemented the next phase of its plan: to spread the killing across the nation by exploiting Rwanda's culture of obedience. They told Hutus the Tutsi rebels were foreign invaders, bent on turning them into slaves. Their propaganda reminded Hutus that the Tutsis had ruled them for centuries, often treating them with disdain.
Tutsis used to abuse Hutus. For example, if a Tutsi chief wished to stand up from his chair, he would call up a Hutu who would allow his foot to be pierced by the Tutsi's spear as he stood up. My understanding is that Tutsis are not originally from Rwanda. I heard that they might have come from Egypt or somewhere else.
An extremist hate radio station told Hutus to eliminate their Tutsi neighbors.
Then, when the war began, people changed. One day across the valley, we saw houses burning and people fleeing from their homes.
A 12-year-old girl named Valentina followed her parents into the Catholic Church in Nyirabuye, where along with more than 5,000 other Tutsis, they waited. It was April the 15th.
I was a young girl. My parents thought the church was safe because no one will be killed in a church. When we arrived, I could see the older people were very sad and upset. Everybody was scared, but nobody knew what was going to happen.
The leader of the local community told us that Tutsis had fled to Nyaruye and that we had to go there and kill them. On the morning of April 15th, we woke up and started walking towards the church. It was like going to the marketplace.
I saw the soldiers come in, and they started shooting and shooting. All we had to defend ourselves were rocks. Then our local governor, Gachumbitsi, came in and stood in front of us. Gachumbitsi said that everyone should know what they were there for. He said that all those who were there should be killed, that no one should survive. Then they started killing, hacking with their machetes. They kept doing it, and I was hiding under dead people. They didn't kill me because of the blood covering me. They thought they had killed me.
It was as if we were taken over by Satan. When Satan is using you, you lose your mind. We were not ourselves. You couldn't be normal and you start butchering people for no reason. We had been attacked by the devil.
It was very late, around 2 a.m. when the Interahamwe came back. One of them stepped on my head. He was shaking me with his foot to see if I was alive. He said, "This thing is dead," and so they left. I lived among the dead for a long time. At night, the dogs would come to eat the bodies. Once the dog was eating someone next to me. I threw something at the dog and he ran away. I hid in a small room. That's where I stayed and slept for 43 days.
As the Tutsi rebel army pushed south towards the capital, they found evidence of massacres in village after village. With the rebels approaching, extremist Hutus unleashed more Interahamwe militias to accelerate the killing. The murdered prime minister had been replaced by Jean Kambanda, who incited followers to repulse the Tutsi rebels and their sympathizers, known as Inkotanyi.
The Inkotanyi did not come to conquer power only. They are after you too. They want to kill you all. Guns are not only for soldiers. Every person can own a gun. If they shoot, you shoot back. I too carry one all the time. Here it is.
Extremist Hutus referred to Tutsi survivors as those not finished off. The Red Cross had never left Rwanda, and those who stayed confronted a stark moral dilemma. What do you do in the face of evil? A BBC reporter spoke to the Red Cross leader in Rwanda, Philippe Gaillard.
Walking around here, the images are quite horrific. You've been dealing with this for a long time. What do you think of it?
I don't know if I still feel something. I have a brain of iron. That's the way I've survived. That's the way I can speak to you in a so clear language.
Is there a high price to be paid for that kind of brain of iron? Later on, perhaps?
Later on, maybe. For the time being, so far, so good.
Soon after the killing began, Gaillard decided he had to challenge the extremist government. Rwandan troops had stopped a Red Cross ambulance and killed 6 patients.
I decided to call my headquarters in Geneva to tell the story. And my counterpart in Geneva told me, do you think we could make it public? And then you think twice. I mean, because if you make it public, then you know that people who might kill you would really decide to kill you because of what you told. Huh? And it was a bit poker. We decided to do it. So following day, BBC, Reuters, Radio France Internationale, it was everywhere.
The publicity embarrassed the extremists, and their government gave the Red Cross safe passage throughout Rwanda.
So these 6 people didn't die for nothing. I mean, they, because of their deaths, hundreds of other people could be saved.
Gaillard cultivated a relationship with the extremist leadership, which he believes helped the Red Cross save 65,000 lives.
When we talk about mass saving, I think that's the best and the only way is to talk with the people who want to kill them. Yeah? I remember one day I met, by chance, Colonel Theonest Bagosora. And I told him, Colonel, do something to stop the killings. I mean, this is absurd. I mean, this is suicide. I mean, and his answer was, there are words you never forget. You know? His answer was, listen to sir, if I want, tomorrow I can recruit 50,000 more in Teramwe. So I took him by the shirt. I'm 58 kilograms and he must be 115. You know? I took him by the shirt, looked his eyes, and told him, Theonest, you will lose the war.
Gaillard's network of aid workers across Rwanda gave him the most accurate count of the death toll. He estimated that in the first 2 weeks, 100,000 Rwandans had been killed. The Red Cross has a tradition of neutrality and public silence, but Gaillard decided that this genocide would be different.
The International Committee of the Red Cross, which is a 140 years old organization, was not active during the Armenian genocide, shut up during the Holocaust. Everybody knew what was happening with the Jews. In such circumstances, if you don't at least speak out clearly, and you are participating to the genocide. I mean, if you just shut up when you see what you see, I mean, morally, ethically, you cannot shut up. It's a responsibility to talk, to speak out. Yeah.
A Rwandan human rights activist traveled to Washington. She'd been smuggled out of Kigali after a harrowing ordeal. Monique Mujawa Maria came to tell American officials what was happening in her country and ask for stronger U.S. action.
The first person who I met when I arrived in the United States was Anthony Lake, who at the time was National Security Advisor. I will always remember him. He was very pleased to see me.
Well, I met with Monique and was moved and terrified for her by her story of barely escaping, hiding in the attic for a while and then getting out.
I think he was personally affected by what was happening in Rwanda. But as a government official, he was not ready to take action. He didn't want to.
And it's not that I didn't care. It's that any caring wasn't translated into any focus, any attention really. On something like this, it would have taken quite a push. And there's no question in my mind that in the end the president would have had to push it.
A congressional official responsible for Africa gave me an explanation which was discouraging but also enlightening. He said, "Listen, Monique, the United States has no friends. The United States has interests. And in the United States, there is no interest in Rwanda. And we are not interested in sending young American Marines to bring them back in coffins. We have no incentive."
As Monique lobbied Washington, America and the entire UN Security Council voted to withdraw 90% of the peacekeepers in Rwanda. This was the compromise Madeleine Albright had argued for. At least a token force was allowed to remain.
It was a very, very difficult time, and the situation was unclear. You know, in retrospect, it all looks very clear, but when you were at the time, when it was unclear about what was happening in Rwanda, it was very clear that Congress was not supportive of additional peacekeepers, very clear that the Pentagon was not interested in getting deeply involved.
What was your gut feeling about the effectiveness of that force that was being left behind?
Well, I think that my gut feeling was that it couldn't do what it had to do.
It was like the world had disappeared out there. The world just didn't care. And it made no difference what you said or how you said it to them. We could have packed up dead bodies, put them on a Herc, flown to New York, walked into the Security Council and dumped them on the floor in front of the Security Council. And all that would have happened was we would have been charged for illegally using a UN aircraft. They just didn't want to do anything.
Forget any idea that somebody's going to come and help you, Dallaire, or your forces, and that we're going to actually do something positive. We're just going to continue the movement that the Belgians have started of withdrawing and pulling out. That scenario brought an enormous gloom because there's no cavalry coming over the hill.
General Dallaire was left in Kigali with only 450 ill-equipped troops from developing countries. Now he faced the moral burden of bearing witness to a genocide without the means to stop it.
He was abandoned by his own organization. This is terrible. To be abandoned by his own organization, it's terrible. I was always supported. It's a big difference, a huge difference. We needed surgeons, nurses, I mean, this kind of very specialized stuff, you know. It arrived to Rwanda within days. It's very, very efficient, very short. They came. Some people had to be changed because some people got crazy. But then you find other people who, yeah, able to take risks and to do the very little things you can do, which are always miracles. Do miracles. Yeah, in such context, it's the only way to do something, I guess.
It's Monday, 25th of April. It's a rainy, cold day. Day before the beginning of the historic elections in South Africa. And rockets have just been flying over the house.
Carl Wilkins, the only American not to evacuate from Rwanda, hadn't left his home in nearly 3 weeks.
And so when I went out, it was wild. There were horses roaming the streets, and there's no horses in Rwanda except at the Belgian club, and someone, I guess, had let them out of their stalls. And there were guys sitting at roadblocks in couches, you know, and they'd have an old shotgun across their lap, and they'd have like a monkey, you know, on a leash, some foreigner's pet who had fled. Little kids were playing with all kinds of Western toys all over the city. Little Rwandan kids had never seen these toys before, much less been able to touch them and play with them. It was a wild place out there.
Gromo Alex, a veteran UN aid worker, volunteered to come back to Rwanda and set up a humanitarian team in Kigali.
Very few people get opportunities to be real heroes. So I wanted to be one of those, you know, one of those few.
During the genocide, what was it like right here?
Very dead quiet. Barriers on most of the, almost any road entering into the neighborhood was blocked off with tree stumps or logs or beer cases.
Each day, Gromo Alex delivered food to refugees at UN safe havens in the city and learned to navigate the Interahamwe roadblocks.
Started as early as we could in the morning, not too early. We tried to finish it as early in the afternoon as possible because by noon they had been drinking and were intoxicated. And they had either killed people and wanted to kill more, or they hadn't killed and they wanted to kill. Killing was like a drink, that if you took one drink, you wanted another one, and you wanted another. You wanted to become more and more intoxicated. Sometimes people kill once, and then to lessen the impact of that murder on their psyches or on their conscience, that they kill again, and then they kill again. And then each murder drives you to kill again, not so much that you forget that you've killed before, but that you've killed, and it just becomes part of you, and you've just got to kill and kill and kill.
"4 weeks into the genocide, the Red Cross estimated 300,000 Rwandans had been killed.
I think the conscience of the world has grieved for the slaughter in Rwanda. But we also know from not only the Somalia experience, but from what we read of the conflict between the Hutus and the Tutsis, that there is a political and military element to this. So I think we can take the lessons we learned and perhaps do a better job there.
I think the problem here, for me, for the President, for most of us at senior levels, was that it never became a serious issue. We never came to grips with what in retrospect should have been a central issue of, do we do much more to insist that the international community intervene and go out and find the troops that are necessary, or even contemplate an American intervention itself. That issue just never arose.
The administration left Rwanda to the bureaucrats, and an interagency working group led by the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, Prudence Bushnell.
I mean, what an extraordinary way to spend time. Bye, dear, I'm going off to the office today to sit with my people and talk about, is there any way we can save human beings from being slaughtered when there are no resources, there's no peacekeeping. It was, these were conversations I'll never, ever forget.
Bushnell's hands were tied by the government's policy of non-intervention. So when she called extremist Hutu leaders, she could threaten them only with words.
I would set the alarm for 2 o'clock in the morning and having these bizarre conversations in French. Hello, this is Prudence Bushnell. Stop it. Stop killing people.
When she called General Kagame, the Tutsi rebel leader, Bushnell's instructions were to demand that he halt his advance and negotiate with the extremists.
He was always very dispassionate, but there was a burst in the middle of this conversation of a fair amount of passion when he said to me, "Madam, they're killing my people." And it wasn't part of my instructions to be empathetic, and yet it really pulled at my heart, because I knew they were killing his people.
And indeed, I talked to Pro Bushnell, and I hate remembering the conversation I had with her, because it always brings back those memories that while for us we are focusing on and seeing that hundreds of thousands of people were being killed, somebody else was talking about something else that had nothing to do with saving the lives of these people who are being killed.
The only effort I could make as a human being to sort of reach out a hand of humanity by saying, as I signed off, "General, I wish you peace." And that's the way I ended my conversations with him. It was awful. Excuse me. It was really difficult.
As the outside world left Rwanda to its fate, one UN soldier in Kigali was taking matters into his own hands. Captain Mbaijang of Senegal was an unarmed UN observer, renowned for his ability to charm his way past the killers.
He was a tall guy. And he had a smile, a big toothy smile. Even in all this, gore and hatred, as long as you can have that brief glimpse of, a smile or something to laugh about that's good, you grab onto it. And with Mbai, I think that's what everybody did. At all those checkpoints, they all knew him.
From the first hours of the genocide, Captain Mbai had ignored orders to remain neutral. He had rescued the children of Prime Minister Agath, hiding them in a closet while their mother was being killed. Based at the Hotel Milcolin, a safe haven in the center of Kigali, Captain Mbai was part of a group of UN observers whose very presence was often enough to keep the killers at bay.
These guys didn't move. This heart of observers, the gang that stayed at the Milcolin, there was 7 or 8 of them. That particular group, on their own initiative, would go to places where people told there might be people hidden, and they would get them out and bring them to either Milcolin or another safe place that we had. And Yang was one of those leaders in that. I mean, he was evident, courageous, and risk-taking.
But even General Dallaire didn't realize the full extent of Captain Mbai's secret rescue missions.
We'd see in this back room in Amahoro Hotel, the headquarters, large groups of people that all of a sudden appeared and then the next day were gone. We began to put together that Mbai was bringing people from all over town to the headquarters and then evacuating them or having them picked up and taken to safety elsewhere.
I knew what Mbai Diagne was doing. I had a very, very strong suspicion, put it that way, of what he was doing. And had I investigated, I could have found out, but I didn't want to find out. I didn't want to say there is a Senegalese officer saving people in this town. You can imagine what the impact of that would have been. He would have been killed.
While observers like Captain Mbai were saving hundreds of lives, General Dallaire had a plan to save tens of thousands by creating more safe havens like the few his troops were already protecting in Kigali.
Dallaire had a plan which was basically to secure football stadiums in every town around Rwanda. Football stadiums were particularly defendable areas because they had large concrete stands. And if you have 50 soldiers with guns on the top of those stands, you can stop people coming in to kill people, basically. So I think it was very doable if there had been a much bigger UN, not that much bigger, a few thousand well-armed UN soldiers.
General, you do say that people are being killed, taken out of fight in Kigali. What can the UN do about it?
Send me troops.
Will you send troops?
Well, what more do you want me to say? I'm waiting here. So send me troops.
But the UN Security Council was skeptical.
Yeah, we knew what Dallaire was saying, but remember, the Belgians, which were the primary Western European force, had left. And there weren't many other European forces that had real capacity, raising their hand up in the air, volunteering to put battalions on the ground in Rwanda. That just didn't exist.
American officials worried that UN troops would get embroiled in Rwanda's civil war, because the Tutsi rebels of the Rwanda Patriotic Front made it clear they would oppose a robust UN force.
At the time, the RPF was determined to take Kigali, take power back in Kigali, and they weren't interested in the UN coming back in. They saw a UN force as being a force that would prop up the Hutu regime that was committing the very atrocities that were ongoing. So the RPF was not interested in a UN force, and this was crucial to our decision-making regarding whether a force would go in and whether it would go into Kigali.
The UN told Dallaire he would get no more troops. And without a larger force, all he could do was to keep trying to negotiate a ceasefire between the Tutsi rebels and the Hutu government.
I was also determined to continue to keep negotiations going, because maybe it'll stop. Maybe with a ceasefire, between the two belligerents, we might be able to stop the massacring.
When the ceasefire talks again went nowhere, Dallaire asked to meet directly with the commanders of the death squads.
I had to crack the nut of the militias. And so I asked Bagosora, I said, listen, let me meet these guys. Let me negotiate with them.
Inside a Kigali hotel, the leaders of the Interahamwe were waiting.
And so when I arrived, Bagosora introduced them. And as I was looking at them and shaking their hands, I noticed some blood spots still on them. And all of a sudden they disappeared from being human. All of a sudden, something happened that turned them into non-human things. And I was not talking with humans. I literally was talking with evil. It even became a very difficult ethical problem. Do I actually negotiate with the devil to save people? Or do I wipe it out? I shoot the bastards right there. I haven't answered that question yet.
The Interahamwe continued to threaten UN safe havens like Saint Famille Church in Kigali. The Tutsi refugees inside suspected the Hutu priest was helping the killers. They appealed to Dallaire.
There were like two Senegalese military who were coming from time to time. And we said, if they stay here permanently, we will be more or less protected, because, people did not want to kill and have and being seen, especially by the international community, journalists and so on.
Dallaire placed the church under UN guard. As elsewhere, sometimes all he had to offer was a couple of unarmed UN soldiers.
Quite amazingly, these people who were very brave managed here and at the ICRC hospital to prevent armed people from coming in saying, stop, you're not allowed in here. This site is protected by the UN. And you ask yourself, well, here's one guy with no gun sitting on a wooden chair all day, and you're all night, not sleeping, and he's able with no gun to convince people that they're not allowed in here to kill people. I mean, there were some powerful, brave things that were being done by UN soldiers, completely devoid of any support from New York. Forget it, I'm sorry. Nothing came from those people.
Everybody knew every day live what was happening in this country. You could follow that every day on TV, on radio. Who moved? Nobody. Yeah.
So I spoke to the Red Cross representative and I asked him how many people had been killed. And Philippe said something along the lines of, In the first few weeks, I said that 100,000 people had been killed. A few weeks later, I said, loud and clear, that I think 500,000 people have been killed. And now you're another journalist, and you're asking me again, and I'm telling you, I can't count anymore. 500,000 people have been killed, and I've stopped counting.
They cannot tell us or tell me that they didn't know. They were told every day what was happening there. So then don't come back to me and tell me, sorry, we didn't know. No. Everybody knew.
After the Holocaust, the world said never again and adopted a UN convention requiring that future genocides be stopped. When genocide happened in Rwanda, the United States, along with most other governments, simply avoided using the word.
Comment on that, or a view as to whether or not what is happening could be genocide?
Well, as I think you know, the use of the term genocide has a very precise legal meaning, although it's not strictly a legal determination. There are other factors in there as well. When in looking at a situation to make a determination about that, before we begin to use that term, we have to know as much as possible about the facts of the situation.
Out of curiosity, given that so many people say that there is genocide underway or something that strongly resembles it, why wouldn't this convention be
Well,
involved?
I think, as you know, this becomes a legal definitional thing, unfortunately, in terms of as horrendous as all these things are, there becomes a definitional question. At the time, I have to make so clear to you that at the time, people just did not have the sense that this was happening in the proportions that it was, and by the time that it happened, you couldn't do anything about it.
6 weeks into the genocide, the Security Council finally changed course and authorized over 5,000 more peacekeepers for Rwanda. But none were immediately available.
The UN doesn't have any troops, we borrow them from governments. And I recall on the Rwanda thing, we approached about 80 governments trying to get offers of troops, and they wouldn't give them to us.
Washington promised logistical support. But as bodies flowed out of Rwanda down the rivers of Central Africa, State Department officials struggled to get the Pentagon to act.
At one point I had recommended that in response to the hate propaganda radio known as Radio Milcolin, that the U.S. could use military radio jamming equipment to block those radio transmissions, to take them off the air effectively. One lawyer from the Pentagon made the argument that that would be contrary to the U.S. constitutional protection of freedom of the press, freedom of speech.
Truly atrocious that we weren't able to do something because of some legal nicety about international radio conventions. And then the APC thing as sort of emblematic, symptomatic.
Washington had agreed to send 50 armored personnel carriers to the UN peacekeepers, but they would take 3 months to arrive.
Well, because we spent so much time wrangling about who was going to pay for them, who was going to pay for refurbishing them, who was going to transport them, who's going to pay for the transport, who's going to pay for the training of the Ghanaians so that they could use them. I mean, and again, it's sort of bureaucracy at its very worst, but we couldn't, at our level, we couldn't break through that. Somebody else would have had to intervened to say, this is nonsense, get on with it, do it.
The bureaucratic paralysis emerged from the administration's decision not to intervene. 7 weeks into the genocide, President Clinton restated his policy that the U.S. would intervene in a humanitarian crisis only if it were in America's national interest.
The end of the superpower standoff lifted the lid from a cauldron of long simmering hatreds. Now the entire global terrain is bloody with such conflicts, from Rwanda to Georgia. Whether we get involved in any of the world's ethnic conflicts, in the end must depend on the cumulative weight of the American interests at stake.
The one American to stay in Kigali when the embassy closed probably saved more lives during the genocide than the entire U.S. government. Carl Wilkins discovered the Interahamwe had surrounded an orphanage.
One day as we brought a load of water to them, this counselor, local counselor from the area, comes ripping in his little stolen Mercedes station wagon. And as he got out of his car, I looked around, and here surrounding the orphanage, just materializing, it's like about 50 militia guys, camo jackets or camo pants, but all of them with machine guns. And I said to my Rwandan colleague who was driving the truck, I said, siphon as slow as you can. We got to make this last. I don't know what we're going to do, but it seems like they're not coming while we're here.
While his colleagues stayed at the orphanage, Wilkins went to the local government headquarters looking for help.
And a young secretary I'd become friends with, he says, the Prime Minister's here. And I'm like, so what's that mean? And he's like, ask him. And I'm like, ask him? You know, it's like that's the stupidest thing you could imagine, to ask this guy who is obviously orchestrating the genocide, a key player, and yet I had no other options. And door opens, everybody snaps to attention, and here comes Kabanda and his group, a little entourage, and they're coming down the hall, and I'm, you know, and I stand up and I put my hand out and I said, Mr. Prime Minister, I'm Carl Wilkins, the director of ADRA. And he stops and he looks at me, and then he takes my hand and shakes it. And he said, yeah, I've heard about you and your work. How is it? And I said, well, honestly, sir, it's not very good right now. The orphans at Kasimba are surrounded, and I think there's going to be a massacre if there hasn't been already. Just tell them, you know. And he turns around, talks to some of his aides or whatever. He says, we're aware of the situation, and those orphans are going to be safe. I'll see to it.
The orphans were saved. Years later, Prime Minister Kambanda would be convicted of genocide by a UN tribunal.
You know, the genocide is so complicated. I was in so many positions that could have been interpreted as compromising or even collaborating with the enemy, huh? You know, who's going to believe someone who goes to court and says, well, actually, I asked Kabanda to help me save some Tutsis? Huh? Who's going to believe that? The stuff in a genocide just turns, and that's why, you know, the thing about this is we got to recognize in each one of us, there's such a potential for good, and there's such a potential for evil.
By late May, the extremists were running out of Tutsis to kill. They threatened to storm the UN sanctuary at the Hotel Milcolin. Captain Mbai Jang of Senegal led 600 Tutsis to a safer part of town.
And the militia attacked the convoys. And I saw individual soldiers, including Captain Baidian, actually kicking people off because they didn't have guns. The UN soldiers didn't have guns. They were actually kicking people off and saying, you can't come up here. These people, we're saving these people.
A few days later, Captain Mbai was driving from the hotel back to UN headquarters. He stopped at this bridge, a final checkpoint.
A mortar had landed behind his car, and shrapnel came through the back window and in the back of his head, and apparently killed him instantly. They're calling around for a body bag, and there's no body bags. There's not a body bag. There's nothing left. I mean, there's nothing. And you wonder, at this time we're starting to put it together, and we're saying, here's a guy who gave his ultimate, who did everything, and we don't even have a body bag, Nothing to, show him some respect. We had some UNICEF plastic sheeting, and we had some tape. We're folding them up, and, the creases aren't right, because his feet are so damn big. And you don't want that for him. You want it to be like, just laid out perfectly, so that, when people look at him, they know that he was something great.
No one knows how many lives Captain Mbai Jiang personally saved. At least 100. Perhaps 1,000.
Captain Mbai Jiang is one of the best officers in my army. And the job he done here, none of us did it.
I remember bursting into tears with a colleague of his, a Senegalese captain. And the captain said to me, "You're a journalist, I'm a soldier. Now you've got to tell the world what Mbai Jiang did. You've got to tell the people that he saved lots of lives. Even while the UN was shamefully pulling out its troops, he was saving people's lives. And please tell the world."
We carried the stretcher into the Hercules aircraft. It was a very, very low point. Very low point. Such an incredibly courageous individual, amongst others, who were strong and courageous. But he seemed to be untouchable.
As the civil war in Rwanda was drawing to a close, the BBC's Fergal Keane was traveling with the advancing Tutsi rebels. One evening in late May, they approached the church at Nyarabuye, where more than 5,000 Tutsis had sought refuge.
We got out of the car. And in front of the church there were some bodies on the ground. You find yourself walking along and you're stepping around and stepping over bodies. And then we walked down this path through the church compound, and it was heavily overgrown. And we went down further until we came to this kind of open courtyard area where the bodies were stacked in against the walls. And it started to get dark, and then we went into the church, and there was no light in the church itself. You're walking around in the dark, and you suddenly, the light points here, and you see a kid's body. And you know it's a kid because he's wearing his khaki school uniform. And he's lying there, and his head's been bludgeoned away. Then down in another corner, there's a man, his body lying there. As we're coming out, we hear noises. Noises from one of the rooms. And I got very, very scared. And one of the drivers with us, a Ugandan, said, "Don't worry, it's only rats. Rats." And we left, and I just remember looking up at the church itself, and there's this white statue of Christ standing with his arms open. And then as you look down from him, there's the remains of a human body underneath. And I was raised as a Catholic. And I kind of drifted away big time from religion. But I prayed so hard. I said, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Give us thy kingdom come." I needed to believe in something. I think going to Nyarabuye, seeing what had happened there a few weeks earlier, and coming face to face with a human capacity for evil on a scale I just hadn't imagined. You can imagine it in your mind, but until you experience it and smell it, until you walk there, then that changes you. But I don't welcome the fact that I was changed. We heard that there were survivors, and we got to the mayor's offices, the offices that had been used by the man accused of leading the genocide. And we walked in, and sitting on the ground were this woman and I think 2 children, and one of the children, she looked in the most terrible state. We could see that her hand was black, being hacked away. And there was a wound on the back of her head as well. The nurse was trying to dress the wounds, and I looked at that kid and I said, "She's not going to make it. There's no way." The kid's name was Valentina.
I felt a lot of pain, because my fingers had been chopped off and my head had been cut. I was very sad because my family was all dead. I didn't think I was going to survive.
We have every reason to believe that acts of genocide have occurred.
How many acts of genocide does it take to make genocide?
Alan, that's just not a question that I'm in a position to answer.
True that you have specific guidance not to use the word genocide in isolation, but always to preface it with this word acts of.
I have guidance which I try to use as best as I can. I'm not. I have. There are formulations that we are using that we are trying to be consistent in our use of. I don't have an absolute categorical prescription against something, but I have the definitions, I have phraseology which has
been It is ludicrous in retrospect that the discussion was about, well, what might we be viewed if we declare that there is genocide and then we are not in a position or not ready or willing or able to do anything about it. The fact of the matter is it was there, and the fact that we didn't say so was already tarnishing our credibility and our capacity to do something about it. So, but I think, as I said, I think that's probably one of the most shameful passages in this whole exercise was the length of time and the amount of tortured discussion it took us to actually come to that determination.
The Rwandan genocide came to an end in July 1994. It had lasted 100 days and ended only when the Tutsi rebels won the civil war. Hutu extremists had killed over 800,000 people as the world stood by.
When I'd lay down at night in the hallway there was a hope that something's gonna happen, you know? Something's gotta happen. This thing didn't end in a couple days like we thought it did. It didn't end in a week or two like we thought it would. Somebody's gonna do something. By the time the genocide was over, I was so angry at America. America the beautiful, America the brave. I was angry with our government. I was angry with people who could do something, even the simplest things, and they didn't.
As the years passed, world leaders who did little as genocide happened on their watch came to places like Nyarabuye on pilgrimages of contrition.
At what point did I start saying to myself, we should have done more? When did that start coming to me? Honestly, it didn't start happening probably until I went to Rwanda, saw the bodies. It was worse than anything I had seen in Vietnam. And after that, I began understanding, or at least asking myself, whether we couldn't have done more.
I think going to Rwanda was one of the biggest shocks for me. I went to this church on Lake, and then there was a mass grave, and there was a small skeleton that they had managed to excavate, which was about the size of my grandchild at that time. And you could see the machete mark on the skull. I wish that I had pushed for a large humanitarian intervention. People would have thought I was crazy. It would never have happened, but I would have felt better about my own role in this.
It was a very painful and traumatic experience for me personally. And I think in some way for the United Nations, it's not something that you forget. If we were to be confronted with a new Rwanda, is the world ready to do it? Would the world move in to stop it? And my answer is, I really don't know. I wish I can say yes. But I'm not convinced that we will see the kind of political will and the action required to stop it.
Eventually, President Clinton himself came to Rwanda.
I have come today to pay the respects of my nation to all who suffered and all who perished in the Rwandan genocide. It may seem strange to you here, especially the many of you who lost members of your family, but all over the world there were people like me sitting in offices day after day after day who did not fully appreciate the depth and the speed with which you were being engulfed by this unimaginable terror.
In his remarks, which were billed as an apology, Clinton did say the U.S. had made mistakes. But he never actually said he was sorry. He met with survivors and heard the human consequences of his policy of non-intervention. And then he left.
Mr. President, the lack of intervention in Rwanda, can you tell us why the U.S. didn't intervene?
I think that the people that were bringing these decisions to me felt that the Congress was still reeling from what had happened in Somalia. And by the time they finally, I sort of started focusing on this and seeing the news reports coming out of it, it was too late to do anything about it. And I feel terrible about it because I think we could have sent 5,000, 10,000 troops there and saved a couple 100,000 lives. I think we could have saved about half of them. But I will always regret that Rwandan thing. I will always feel terrible about it.
I came back with, and still live with, this enormous guilt. I started falling into these depressions, and it's like a spiral. And so I'd find scotch mostly, and I'd just drink myself and drink, and then I'd cut myself or try to jump off things, because the pain of killing yourself is nothing compared to the pain of living with this. I was the commander, my mission failed, and hundreds of thousands of people died. And that I can't find any solace in statements like I did my best. The commander can't use that as a reference in any operation. He succeeds or he fails. And then he stands by and to be accused of and to be held accountable for. And my mission failed. And that's that.
And I don't feel guilty. I never felt guilty. Daler felt guilty all the time. And I think this is the reason why he's still deeply wounded, while my scars are okay. Yeah. And when we came back from Rwanda with my wife, we were deliberately, we had no children. And it was so evident for her, for me, that after this experience, we both wanted to create life. I had never explained to my son that he was a product of a genocide. It's not easy to explain. It is. Yeah. Nothing else, Greg.
There is more to explore about this powerful human story at Frontline's website.
And rockets have just been flying over the
Video
house.
diaries of those few who tried to save lives. Read Frontline's interviews with the key decision makers in the UN and the US government, as well as with diplomats, journalists, and aid workers. A report on a new world standard on the responsibility to protect, and the progress of the International Criminal Tribunal, and much more at pbs.org.
Support for Frontline is provided by U.S. News and World Report.
Trust. For over 70 years, a commitment to playing it straight, getting it right. U.S. News and World Report. Trust matters.
With additional funding from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Frontline is made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Yes, I've been living inside of you, but I guess it's time I set me free, and there's nothing that you can do. I hope you can see.
I can't seem to keep people around me, cause I'm scared that they might know the truth all about me. Then they might doubt me, there's no other route. I wanted to shout, but it's too late now, cause I'm drowning. Got two-faced like I'm a clown, man. Life is too great, no, it's astounding. I'm in good shape, ma, but you know that I'm drowning like a cup in a cage. I can't cope with this hopelessness, though I try to be open and go with it, but I'm soaking in the pain like a wind never stop flowing in. As I'm floating in a glowing river through a golden gate, trying to motivate. Yeah, I do my fucking best, but there's two voices in my head, I just can't. I just fucking can't.
Yes, I've been living inside of you, but I guess it's time I set me free, and there's nothing that you can do. I hope you can see me. Yes, I've been living inside of you, but I guess it's time I set me free, there's nothing that you can do. I hope you can see.
Babe, what you looking like this? You be fine, trust me, just in time we get along. No, leave me alone. Why, yes, can you see that you are alone, big? We're now sitting in our own throne, big. We need nobody, can you see it through? But it's not you who I should be listening to. Guess what, big? Nobody fucking needed you. No, and nobody fucking needed me. Yeah, they never needed us. Like when they nailed Jesus up, there's no fucking heaven, then they don't believe in us. But they my friend, I'm the only one that you can trust. Yeah, god damn it, you an idiot. Go online, be a slave for the media. Like you forgot what your father said. Are you serious? Look at yourself, big. You fucking idiots.
Yes, I've been living inside of you, but I guess this time I set me free.
Oh, I love you.
There's nothing that you can do.
I see.
I hope you can see.
There's no one else.
Yes, I've been living inside of you.
You have to accept it.
But I guess this time I set me free. And there's nothing that you can do.